Me again. This is an addendum to that first intro video to Module 2A about the American Revolution and the creation of the U.S. Constitution. I was reviewing it and going, all right, okay, yeah. I left a few things out. This will happen. So let me supplement it just a little bit here, and then I'll be on my way and get out of your hair. All right. I talked, right, at the beginning of that clip about how different parts of the American population had different motivations for revolution from the mother country. Right, so we know that mercantilism was a fundamental issue. It's not covered in our book. It's not covered in most intro books. I don't know why not. It's so deeply central to why revolution, right? The standard emphasis, and I'm sure you got it in high school, right, was taxation. Sure, that's a significant economic issue for the colonists. Of course it is, right? Who loves taxes? Nobody. But mercantilism, I think, was an even larger issue. And all right, so mercantilism, right? And we have it still today, right? We know that Donald Trump, when he was president, and if he's reelected in November, right, is going to pursue mercantilism with a vengeance, right? Put tariffs on imports in order to limit competition from countries like China, to protect American industry, right? It's an understandable impulse, right? All elected officials have the same impulse because we, the people, tend to like mercantilism because they feel like it protects us from foreign competition. The problem is, right, with mercantilism, it raises prices for the American consumer by a lot. I just saw a study that came out. They said that it might vary from one sort of policy or industry to another, but in general, if you raise tariffs on, let's say, imports from China by 25, let's say washing machines, right, from China. Let's say we're going to put a 25% tariff on those Chinese imports to protect the ability of American manufacturers to compete to sell washing machines to Americans, right? Because China has low labor costs, minimal environmental regulations. They can often do it more cheaply. And they pay their workers a far lower wage. The estimates are that when you raise the tariffs on Chinese imports of, let's say, washing machines by 25% to make them more expensive here so that America can compete better, because ours are just going to be more expensive, it raises the prices for consumers by about 25%. It's a 1-to-1 ratio, right? So that's the problem around here. That's the problem with mercantilism, right? Is that you might benefit those who work in the industry of manufacturing washing machines in the United States, which is going to be a relatively small number of people. And you're disbenefiting nearly all Americans in terms of much higher prices for consumer goods, right? So mercantilism is a little bit of an illusion, but it's politically very popular. Okay. And Adam Smith, back in 1776, in a nifty little book called The Wealth of Nations, argued vehemently against mercantilism, right? He wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. And he said, from whence comes the wealth of nations? Global free market, right? He argued against mercantilism. And he wasn't arguing against socialism. That wasn't even a thing back then. That comes later. He was arguing against mercantilism, saying, don't do it, right? Because we erect trade barriers, consumers suffer. China erects trade barriers. France, Britain, Taiwan, Norway, on and on, right? Everybody, the more trade barriers go up here, the more they go up elsewhere. And pretty soon, right, you paralyze global trade. And the world becomes poorer for it. So Adam Smith recognized that the political desirability of mercantilism, but he argued against the economic impact of mercantilism, which is bad mojo, he argued. I find his arguments pretty convincing. But that's easy for me to say. I don't have to get elected. So, mercantilism, a really important issue for why the American Revolution back then, and it's still an important issue across the globe, and an ongoing battle over what level is appropriate. I think some level is appropriate. because there are more concerns than just prices and economic issues. There's questions about national security. Right? President Biden signed into law a bipartisan law a few years ago, early on in his presidency, right? The CHIPS Act that said we're going to subsidize. That's another way to do mercantilism: subsidize American industry, subsidize its ability to produce things more cheaply and more efficiently. It's the other side of the mercantilism equation. Subsidize what can amount to exports, tariffs on imports. Right, the CHIPS Act, because very few high-end computer chips are made in the U.S. right now. They're made mostly over in Asia. And the argument is, well, shit, right? That's not good, because what do you need to run your military and industry? These high-end chips. And what if we get into a dispute with an Asian country like China, or Taiwan for that matter, and they decide they're going to cut off the flow of chips to America? Right, we'd be screwed. Our national security would suffer. Right, so Biden, Republicans, and Democrats in Congress said that's not acceptable. That's bad for our national security. We're going to greatly subsidize the ability of Americans to manufacture high-end computer chips. It's a national security question, right? So there I'd be like, yeah, hell yeah, mercantilism. But you want to keep it to a minimum, and not maybe on things like washing machines or steel. All right, so coming back around, sorry, everything's connected. The problem, I've been doing this for so long, right, that I always see all the connections, and to others it can seem overwhelming. I apologize, but the connections are real and analytically fruitful. So that's why I do that. So who was affected the most by mercantilist policies emanating from Great Britain towards the colonies? Right. I did mention the New England merchants. That's correct. Although I didn't specify how they would benefit without mercantilism emanating from Great Britain. Right. They would benefit because, right, instead of simply making their money off of purchasing American natural resources like lumber or tobacco leaves, or fish, or beaver pelts, right? They would purchase them from American merchants from New England. They would purchase them from Americans. They'd load up their ships, right? They'd cross the Atlantic Ocean, sell them in British cities like London and Liverpool and Manchester, right? And make their money that way, right? With a markup. Good for the merchants. New England merchants made a lot of money that way. But they knew they could make more money, right? If Americans could not only grow tobacco leaves, but turn them into a finished product like pipe tobacco or chewing tobacco. They knew that if Americans could not only harvest beaver for their pelts, but also turn those pelts into fur hats, like the one Benjamin Franklin wore, they could then, right, purchase those fur hats and market those globally and make more money. That if Americans could not only harvest trees, but turn that wood into furniture or ships, right, they could then market those globally and make a lot more money. So those are the ways in which New England merchants could see quite clearly and accurately that if America wasn't burdened by mercantilist policies from the mother country, they could then engage in the purchase and sale of finished goods and do that on a global basis, right? Because they were restricted under mercantilism to only selling raw materials to Britain. What if they could sell both raw materials and finished goods to anybody in the world, right? Because then Britain might offer an okay price for a finished good or a raw material, but France might offer a better price, right? And then you play them off against each other and you make maximum profit. So the New England merchants were a powerful economic elite with a strong vested interest in revolution to get rid of mercantilism from Great Britain. Similarly, and this is what I forgot. Similarly, the owners of the southern plantations, right, growing things like cotton and tobacco. They also saw that if they could turn their raw materials into finished goods and market those themselves, they could also make a lot more money than just selling raw materials to the Brits. So those two groups in particular, right, these were the economic elites in America at the time. The New England merchants, the plantation owners in the South. Both of these groups knew that if we could get rid of mercantilism, they can make a lot more money. So they had a strong economic incentive for revolution. But that didn't really speak, right, to the concerns of the average American, like the shopkeeper, the small farmer, the shopkeeper, the laborer. They were more motivated, right, by this idea of governing themselves democratically rather than being governed from abroad by a king and a parliament in which they had no representation. The other thing I left out is another advantage that America had in terms of a military confrontation with Britain. Because on its face, you would say America looked kind of doomed because the Brits, right, were the most powerful country in the world back then. They had the world's best navy. They had a highly professional corps of soldiers, and they could afford to hire German mercenaries. Germany didn't exist at that time, but it was a state called Hesse, I think. And right, they were able to hire Hessian soldiers to do a lot of their military fighting in America. We couldn't afford that, and we didn't have a deep core of professional soldiers. So we were at a huge disadvantage. We didn't have a navy. We didn't have much money. Again, right, we get the French Navy, we get the loans from the Dutch bankers, we get George Washington as commander-in-chief, and he was badass. He made mistakes, but he learned from his mistakes, and he got better. We had old Geo Washington as the commander-in-chief. Without that guy, I don't even know. I don't even want to think about it. But an advantage that George Washington did have as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army was that America, right, at least for that time, even though we were only 13 colonies on the on the east coast of North America, right, that was still geographically vast. We got a lot vaster later on, obviously. That's a different story for a different lecture. But, right, we were a relatively vast land. And we were spread out in terms of population centers, right? We had Boston, we had New York, we had Philadelphia, we had Baltimore, we had Charleston, up and down the coast, right? No one single center of population. Not like London over in Great Britain. So that made it much harder for the Brits, right, to chase us down. Because George Washington could take his troops all over the damn place. He had lots of room to roam and avoid capture and, you know, counterpunch and then run away to fight another day, right? Lots of room. And even if the Brits take, let's say, New York, right? Well, that leaves Boston and Philadelphia to give an old FU to the Brits, right? I think they thought, if we take New York, that's like taking London. Well, it wasn't. I think Philadelphia was our biggest city back then. We had all these population centers. A lot of populations were spread out more to the interior, to the west. It just made it very hard to obliterate the Continental Army because they had so much room to maneuver. And our population centers were spread out. You couldn't take New York and that would end it, right? They took New York and it didn't end it at all. We just shifted our resources to other cities like Boston and Philadelphia. So these were huge structural disadvantages for the Brits. And I forgot to mention that. All right. I've taken too much of your time. Thanks for listening. Catch you on the flippity flip.